Are you still saying that you can't, Chris? The male detective gently asks. Chris says nothing and just sniffs as if he has a cold or he has been crying. Chris's head shakes in a tremor, but he says nothing. There's either I won't or I will or I don't want to. Which is it? You don't want to? The detective gently presses Chris, who says nothing in response and just keeps on sniffling. I've just talked to some people upstairs. I know what you had in your car. The detective is referring to a tarp, gloves, rope, and gasoline. When Chris was arrested, they had found a big tarpaulin, some thick rope, a pair of black gloves, and a large can of gasoline in the car he was driving at the time. The police assumed that the tarp would have been used to wrap up the victim's body, to transport to a secluded location, to be doused in gasoline and then set alight, as a method of eliminating evidence. Chris remains silent in his chair, but raises his head up to meet the eyes of the male detective. He carries on sniffling. His head is visibly shaking. The male detective carries on. Chris, the people that we interviewed that were with you this weekend said that you did not show any remorse. They said that you were your regular old self. No issues. Your dad came in, but he wouldn't give us a statement. He found out through the police. The police called him. The detective leaves a pause. Chris shakes his head from side to side and starts to sob. The female detective reaches out and gently pats Chris on the shoulder in a comforting manner. Chris makes high-pitched sobbing sounds and continues to shake his head from side to side. Chris, you've been sitting here saying, I can't, I can't, I can't. Life is about choices right now. The male detective raises the tone in his voice and begins to point at Chris. Just like the choice you made to go out on Thursday night. She paid for the cab. The detective jabs at a photo on the table from the cab camera. The detective stabs at the photo on the table again for emphasis. She paid for the cab, Chris. Chris turns his head to the side to look at the picture on the table of Katie and himself in the back of the cab. The detective remains silent. Chris lingers on the photo on the table. Do you remember that? The male detective sternly asks, pointing at the taxicab photo. Chris shakes his head in a no gesture while still keeping his arms tightly folded over his chest. You don't remember, or you don't want to remember? I don't remember, Chris replies in a squeaky and pathetic-sounding high-pitched tone. What do you remember? The male detective taps at the photo again impatiently. After she paid for the cab, what do you remember? The male detective uses the power of silence to increase the pressure. Chris sighs and sobs. The female detective strokes Chris's arm and in a soft voice, gentle whispers reassuringly, It's okay. Chris, do you see what's going on here? The male detective asks, and then leaves more silence. The detective now tries an alternative question as a tactic. When you put her down, were you really hoping someone would find her? This is a subtle technique used to get an indirect confession out of a suspect. Answering yes would appeal to Chris's higher morals, and the detective is hoping this will swerve his thought processes from the fact that it would also distinguish him as the culprit in the victim's death. Again, more forcibly, the male detective asks, Chris, when you put her down there, were you hoping someone would find her? Chris sobs and sniffles and shakes his head in a no gesture. The technique fails.